Move one more time, and this gets a lot worse for you. Music. Laughter. Officer, I'm confused. You just authorized me a moment ago to enter my home and get our identification. Are you deaf? I gave you a direct order. Please let go. You're hurting me. Let go of my husband. He didn't do anything. Distress was written across the faces of the elderly couple. Son, come outside. Someone's hurting your father. Son. A massive man stepped into the sunlight, crossing the yard fast. Kellen kept walking, steady and unafraid. Officer, I suggest you let go of my father. Officer Grant Mercer had no idea he was bullying the father of the very man he couldn't afford to cross. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The morning sun fell soft and gold across Maple Ridge Lane. Birds chattered in the oak trees. Sprinklers hissed on someone's lawn down the block. It was the kind of day that made a person forget the world had any sharp edges at all. Elias Brooks knelt in the dirt, pulling weeds from around his tomato plants. At 71, his knees complained more than they used to, but he didn't mind. This garden was his. This house was his. 38 years of mortgage payments had made sure of that. You're going to break your back out here, Maribel said, kneeling beside him with her own pair of gloves. She had been his wife for 42 years, and she still teased him the same way she did when they were young. Better than breaking my spirit sitting inside watching the news, Elias said, and she laughed. Across the street, behind a curtain of white lace, Lila Crow watched them. She had been watching for a while now. Lila didn't garden. She didn't sit on her porch with coffee like her neighbors did. She watched. And lately, every time she looked at the Brooks house, she didn't see a home. She saw dollar signs slipping through her fingers. She picked up her phone. 911, what's your emergency? Yes. Hello. Lila's voice went smooth and worried, like she'd practiced it. I'm calling about my neighborhood. There are 2 people outside a house on Maple Ridge, and I don't recognize them. They look like they're casing the property. I think something's wrong. It was a lie. She knew exactly who Elias and Maribel Brooks were. She'd known them for 6 years. But lies, she'd learned, worked faster than the truth when you wanted something to happen quickly. Minutes later, a patrol car rolled to a stop at the curb, its tires crunching over loose gravel. Elias looked up first. He felt it before he saw it, that old, familiar tightening in his chest that black men of his generation knew well. He had felt it decades earlier. He felt it now. Officer Grant Mercer stepped out of the car, sunglasses on, one hand resting near his belt like he expected trouble before he'd even said hello. Morning, Mercer said. It wasn't a greeting. It was a command dressed up as one. Morning, officer, Elias said, rising slowly to his feet, brushing dirt from his knees. Something wrong? Got a call about suspicious activity at this address. Mercer's eyes moved over both of them, lingering, judging. You 2 live here? 40 years, Maribel said, stepping closer to her husband. This is our home. Mercer didn't soften. If anything, his jaw tightened. I'm going to need to see some ID. Elias blinked. ID for standing in my own yard? That's what I said. There was something in the way Mercer said it. Flat. Bored. Like he'd already decided the answer didn't matter. Like he was just waiting for a reason. Maribel felt her stomach twist. She had read the stories. She had seen the videos. Routine stops that turned into funerals. She wasn't about to let her husband become another name on the news. Officer, we haven't done anything, she said, her voice trembling but firm. We're just gardening. Ma'am, I didn't ask for your opinion. Mercer's tone sharpened, cutting through the morning air like a blade. I asked for ID. Elias felt his pride bristle. but he kept his voice even. Decades of being a black man in America had taught him exactly how dangerous pride could be in a moment like this. "It's inside," Elias said slowly. "In my wallet on the kitchen counter." "Then go get it." Elias hesitated. Something about the way Mercer's hand still hovered near his belt made the simple act of walking to his own front door feel like crossing a minefield. "I'm just going to step inside," Elias said carefully, raising both hands slightly, palms open. "Right there, through that door." Mercer said nothing. He simply watched, his expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses, his fingers twitching near his belt as Elias turned toward the house. Maribel's heart pounded in her ears. The street, usually so peaceful, suddenly felt very, very small. Elias took one step toward his own front door. His foot hit the first porch step. That was all it took. "Stop right there." Mercer's voice cracked across the yard like a whip. "Don't move." Elias froze, one hand still raised. "I'm just getting my—" "I said, don't move." Mercer was already coming around the front of the cruiser fast, his hand no longer hovering near his belt, but gripping it. "Turn around slowly." "Officer, I told you my ID is inside." "You're not listening to me." Mercer's voice climbed higher, sharper, each word landing like a slap. "I gave you a direct order." Elias turned around, slow and careful, his hands lifted to his shoulders. He had done everything right. He had announced every move. None of it seemed to matter. Mercer closed the distance in 3 long strides and grabbed Elias's arm, fingers digging into the loose skin above his elbow. "Ow." Elias winced, his knees buckling slightly under the sudden force. "You're hurting me." Maribel screamed. She rushed forward without thinking, placing herself between her husband and the officer, her small frame trembling with fury and fear. "Let go of him. He didn't do anything." "Ma'am, back up." Mercer's grip didn't loosen. If anything, it tightened. "You're hurting an old man for no reason." Maribel's voice cracked, tears stinging her eyes. "He lives here. This is our house. I don't care whose house it is." Mercer shoved her back with his free hand hard enough that she stumbled against the porch railing. "Back up." Up and down the street doors began to open. Curtains pulled aside. A teenage boy on a bike skidded to a stop at the curb, pulling out his phone. Across the street, an older woman stepped onto her porch, gasping, her own phone already rising to record. "Somebody help them," the woman called out. But nobody moved closer. Nobody wanted to be next. Elias's arm throbbed under Mercer's grip. His chest felt tight, his breath coming shallow and fast. He was 71 years old, standing in his own front yard, being manhandled like a criminal, and all he had done was reach for his wallet. "Please," Elias said, his voice breaking now, all the careful calm draining out of him. "Please, I haven't done anything wrong." "That's what they all say," Mercer muttered, twisting Elias's arm further behind his back. Maribel's mind raced, panic clawing up her throat. She thought of her son who was inside the house right now, who had come home on leave just days ago. Who could fix this? Who could make this stop? "Kellen!" she screamed, turning toward the house, her voice tearing through the morning air. "Kellen, help! Please help us!" For one agonizing second, nothing happened. Then the front door flew open. A man filled the doorway, broad-shouldered, thick through the chest and arms, his frame so large it seemed to block out the morning sun behind him. He moved fast for someone his size, crossing the porch in 2 steps, his eyes locked on the scene unfolding in his parents' yard. Mercer's grip on Elias loosened just slightly as his head snapped toward the new arrival. His eyes widened behind his sunglasses, taking in the sheer size of the man now storming across the lawn. "Get back!" Mercer barked, releasing Elias and pivoting fully, his hand dropping to the taser on his hip. Sir, I need you to stop right there. Kellen didn't stop walking. He didn't run either. His steps were measured, controlled, deliberate. The steps of someone who had been trained not to panic even when every instinct screamed at him to. That's my father, Kellen said, his voice low and even, cutting through the chaos like cold water. Take your hands off him. I said, get back. Mercer's voice cracked with something close to fear now, his fingers fumbling at the taser's holster. I will tase you. I swear to God. The neighbors on the street went silent, phones still raised, every single person holding their breath. Maribel pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, watching her son close the final distance between himself and the officer threatening his father. Elias, cradling his bruised arm, could only whisper one word. Kellen. Kellen Brooks stopped 3 feet from Officer Mercer, close enough to see the sweat beading on the man's forehead, far enough to keep his hands visible and open at his sides. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, a wall of calm in the middle of the storm, and placed himself directly between Mercer and his parents. Get back! Mercer shouted again. But his voice wavered this time, cracking under the weight of his own fear. His hand was on the taser now, fingers white-knuckled around the grip. I will drop you. I swear. You don't need to do that, Kellen said. His tone was flat, steady, the kind of voice trained to stay level even when a building was on fire around it. Sir, I need you to back away from me right now, Mercer barked, though the command sounded thinner with every word, like a balloon losing air. This is your final warning. My name is Kellen Brooks, he said, slow and clear, like he was reciting something he'd said 100 times before. I'm a petty officer with the United States Navy, SEAL Team 8. That man you're holding is my father. This is my parents' home. The words hit the yard like a thunderclap. Mercer blinked. His grip on the taser faltered just slightly. I don't care what you... Check my belt, Kellen said, lifting his shirt slowly, deliberately, revealing the military ID clipped at his waist. It's right there. You can see it yourself. A second officer, younger, freckled, with the name Coulson stitched above his badge, had been hanging back near the cruiser this whole time, watching the chaos unfold with growing unease. Now he stepped closer, his eyes catching something on Kellen's forearm. A tattoo faded slightly with age, the unmistakable shape of a Navy SEAL trident inked into the skin. Mercer. Coulson's voice was quiet, urgent. Mercer, look at his arm. Mercer's eyes flicked down. The trident, the ID, the way this man, easily twice his size, easily strong enough to break him in half if he wanted to, hadn't raised a single hand in anger, hadn't even raised his voice. Something cracked behind Mercer's sunglasses. The certainty that had carried him through this entire encounter, the assumption that had made him grab an old man's arm without a second thought, began to wobble. That doesn't... Mercer's voice was smaller now. That doesn't change anything. It changes everything, Coulson muttered, stepping fully between his partner and Kellen now, one hand raised toward Mercer. Grant, stand down. Now. On the street, the gathered neighbors had gone completely silent. Phones were still raised, but nobody was speaking. The teenage boy on the bike had his mouth hanging open. The woman across the street lowered her phone just slightly, staring in disbelief at the scene rearranging itself in front of her. A Navy SEAL standing in his own parents' yard, being threatened with a taser because a frightened white officer had decided the second he saw a big black man that he must be dangerous. Maribel Brooks sank against the porch railing, one hand pressed to her chest, watching her son stand perfectly still, while an officer twice debated whether or not to electrocute him. Elias cradling his bruised arm. felt something hot and furious rise in his throat. 40 years he'd lived on this street. 40 years of mowing this lawn, waving to neighbors, paying his taxes on time, and it had taken his son announcing his military rank for an officer to finally see him as a human being instead of a threat. Mercer's hand slowly came off the taser. He swallowed hard, glancing at the crowd of phones still pointed at him, at his partner's pale, horrified face, at the old man holding his bruised arm just a few feet away. I'm going to need everyone to just calm down. Kellen didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply watched the officer who seconds ago had been ready to tase him in his own front yard. We are calm, Kellen said quietly. You're the one who needs to think very carefully about what you do next. The street held its breath, waiting to see if Officer Grant Mercer would listen. Officer Mercer lowered his hand fully from his belt, but his face was still flushed, still tight with the kind of anger that comes from being humiliated in front of an audience. All right. His voice came out clipped, forced. All right, everybody, just back off. Show's over. He turned to Elias, who was still rubbing the spot on his arm where Mercer's fingers had dug in hard enough to leave marks that would bruise purple by morning. Sorry for the, Mercer wouldn't meet his eyes. Misunderstanding. It wasn't an apology. Not really. It was the sound a man makes when he wants the moment to end, not the sound a man makes when he means it. Elias heard the difference. So did Maribel. So did every neighbor still standing on their porches with phones in hand. Officer Coulson placed a hand on Mercer's shoulder, steering him back toward the cruiser before he could make things worse. Let's go, Grant. Now. The two officers climbed into their patrol car. Mercer didn't look back as the engine started. The cruiser pulled away from the curb, leaving tire marks of gravel scattered across the street. Within a minute, it had turned the corner and disappeared. Slowly, the neighbors began retreating into their homes. Phones lowered. Doors closed. The street, which moments ago had been frozen in collective horror, returned to its ordinary rhythm, as if nothing had happened at all. As if an elderly man hadn't just been grabbed and threatened in his own yard. As if his son hadn't just stood eye to eye with a loaded taser. Kellen turned to his parents, his shoulders finally dropping from the rigid, controlled posture he'd held the entire confrontation. Dad. He gently took Elias's arm, examining the red marks already forming along the skin. Let me see that. I'm fine, Elias said, though his voice shook slightly as the adrenaline started to drain out of him. You're not fine. Sit down. Elias sat on the porch steps, finally letting his guard fall. Maribel lowered herself beside him, her hands trembling as she reached for her husband's arm, inspecting the bruising forming beneath his sleeve. That man, Maribel said quietly, her voice tight with fury, had no right. No, Kellen agreed. He didn't. Inside, later that evening, the family sat together at the kitchen table. The lamp above them cast a warm yellow glow over plates of food none of them had much appetite for. Elias picked at his rice, his bruised arm resting carefully on a folded towel. You should have seen your face, Maribel said to Kellen, trying to lighten the mood, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. That officer about fainted when he saw your tattoo. Kellen managed a small smile, but it didn't last. I don't like how fast he reached for that taser. I was scared, Elias said. Scared of a black man standing up for his family. That's all that was. Maribel set her fork down, her brow furrowing. You know what bothers me more? Both men looked at her. Leela. Maribel's voice dropped low. She was watching us from her window this morning, right before that officer showed up. Kellen's jaw tightened. You think she called it in? I don't know, Maribel admitted. But she's been odd lately, ever since that meeting about the development project, asking us if we'd ever thought about selling. Elias waved a hand. Lila's harmless, nosy maybe, but harmless. Kellen didn't respond, though something uneasy settled in his chest. A feeling he couldn't quite name. Years of training had taught him to trust that feeling, the same instinct that kept men alive in places far more dangerous than a quiet street in suburbia. After dinner, Kellen walked the perimeter of the house, checking the locks on every window and door, a habit he couldn't shake even at home. When he finally reached the front porch, he stood for a moment, looking out at the dark, empty street where just hours earlier his father had been grabbed and threatened. The street was peaceful now, quiet, ordinary. Kellen reached for the porch light switch and flicked it off, the glow fading into darkness. "It's over," he murmured to himself, though some small, stubborn part of him didn't quite believe it. He locked the door behind him and went inside, unaware that across town, in a precinct office lit by fluorescent lights, Officer Grant Mercer was just beginning to write his version of the story. The precinct was nearly empty that night. Just the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant clatter of someone's keyboard down the hall. Officer Grant Mercer sat alone at his desk, staring at the blank incident report glowing on his computer screen. His face still burned with the memory of it, the crowd of phones, his partner's horrified stare, that enormous man standing perfectly still, calm as still water, while Mercer's hand trembled on his taser. He had been humiliated in front of an entire street, in front of Coulson. Mercer wasn't going to let that be the story. His fingers moved over the keyboard, slow at first, then faster, the lie taking shape word by word. Elias Brooks had been uncooperative, evasive, reaching for something near the doorway. He wrote that Kellen Brooks had charged at him aggressively, that he'd feared for his safety, that he'd been forced to draw his taser in self-defense against a man who refused multiple commands to stand down. None of it was true. All of it sounded believable. When he reached the section requesting body cam footage, Mercer paused only a moment before typing, "Equipment malfunction, no footage available for this incident." He hit submit before he could think too hard about what he was doing. The next morning, Elias Brooks walked into the precinct lobby with Maribel beside him, his bruised arm still tender beneath his sleeve. He approached the front desk with quiet determination. "I'd like to file a complaint," Elias said, "against an Officer Mercer. He assaulted me yesterday in my own front yard." The desk officer took his information without much interest, sliding a thin form across the counter. "Someone will review it." Elias filled out every line carefully, describing the bruising, the shouting, his son's intervention. He handed the form back with a small flicker of hope in his chest. Maybe this would be the start of something. Maybe someone would finally be held accountable. That hope didn't survive the hour. Down the hall in a corner office with his name stenciled on frosted glass, Chief Harlan Crow reviewed both documents side by side, Mercer's incident report and Elias's complaint. Crow was Mercer's uncle, had been since the boy was old enough to wear his first uniform, and he had spent years quietly making problems like this disappear. He read Elias's complaint twice, his expression unreadable. Then he slid it into a drawer and closed it the way a man closes a door he has no intention of opening again. "Damn fool kid," Crow muttered to himself, though there was no real anger in it, just the tired resignation of a man who had cleaned up after his nephew more times than he could count. He pulled Mercer's report toward him instead, scanning the fabricated account of an aggressive, resisting suspect. It was sloppy. It was obvious. But it was also exactly what Crow needed. He picked up his phone and dialed the district attorney's office. "I need a warrant pushed through," Crow said. "Assault on an officer. Resisting arrest. Suspect's name is Kellen Brooks." There was a pause on the other end. "Brooks? Isn't that the—" "Just get it done," Crow said, cutting him off. "Today, if you can." By early afternoon, the warrant was signed and approved. sitting on a desk 3 doors down from where Elias's complaint had been quietly buried in a drawer that would not be opened for months. Crow walked into this bullpen, found 2 officers finishing their lunch, and dropped a folder on their table. "Got an arrest for you," he said. "Kellen Brooks. Address is right there. I want this done by end of day." One of the officers frowned, glancing at the file. "This the SEAL guy? The one from yesterday?" "Doesn't matter what he is," Crow said flatly. "He's got a warrant. Pick him up." The officer hesitated only a second before nodding, sliding the folder into his bag. Crow walked back toward his office, passing the drawer where Elias's complaint sat, buried beneath a stack of unrelated paperwork, untouched, unread by anyone who mattered. Outside his window, the afternoon sun beat down on the parking lot, indifferent to the quiet injustice unfolding inside. Across town, Kellen Brooks sat on his parents' porch, finally beginning to relax after the previous day's chaos, with no idea that a patrol car was already being dispatched to his address, and that by sundown he would be wearing handcuffs in his own front yard. The afternoon sun hung low over Maple Ridge Lane, painting long shadows across the lawn where Kellen Brooks knelt beside his father, helping him stake a row of tomato plants that had been knocked loose during yesterday's commotion. Elias's arm was still sore, the bruises now a deep purple beneath his sleeve, but he refused to let it stop him from working in his own garden. "You don't have to do this," Elias said, watching his son drive a wooden stake into the soil with practiced ease. "I've been gardening longer than you've been alive, and I've been told to rest more than once in my life," Kellen said, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "Doesn't mean I listened," Elias chuckled, the sound easy and warm, the first real laugh either of them had managed since yesterday's confrontation. For a moment, it almost felt like things might go back to normal. Then a patrol car turned onto the street. Kellen noticed it first, his body going still the way it always did when something in his environment shifted. He watched the cruiser slow, then stop directly in front of the house. 2 officers stepped out, hands resting on their belts, their expressions hard and unreadable. Behind them, a second car pulled up. Officer Grant Mercer climbed out of his cruiser and leaned against the door, arms crossed, a thin, satisfied smile creeping across his face. "Kellen Brooks," one of the officers called out, walking up the path with a folded paper in hand. Kellen rose slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. "That's me. We have a warrant for your arrest. Assault on a police officer. Resisting arrest." The words hit the yard like a gunshot. "What?" Elias scrambled to his feet, his bruised arm forgotten. "That's a lie. He's the one who attacked us." "Sir, step back," the officer said, already pulling handcuffs from his belt. Maribel burst out of the front door, drawn by the commotion, her hand flying to her mouth at the sight of 2 officers approaching her son with cuffs raised. No, please, this is a mistake." "Ma'am, please stay back," the second officer warned. Kellen didn't resist. He had learned long ago that resisting only gave men like this exactly what they wanted. He turned, placing his hands behind his back without being asked, his jaw clenched tight enough to ache. "Kellen!" Maribel's scream tore through the street as the cold metal clicked shut around her son's wrists. Mercer watched from beside his cruiser, arms still crossed, his smile widening just slightly. This was the moment he'd been waiting for since yesterday. The moment the giant who had humiliated him in front of an entire street would finally be put in his place. "Funny how things work out," Mercer called over, just loud enough for Kellen to hear. "Big, tough Navy SEAL. Don't look so tough in cuffs, do you?" Kellen didn't respond. He kept his eyes forward, his face a wall of practiced calm, even as fury burned hot beneath his ribs. Neighbors emerged onto porches once again, phones rising for the second time in 2 days. The same teenage boy on his bike skidded to a stop at the curb, mouth hanging open in disbelief. The woman across the street pressed a hand to her chest, shaking her head slowly. Elias stood frozen on the lawn, his chest suddenly tight, a sharp pain blooming behind his ribs that he didn't dare mention with everything else falling apart around him. He pressed a hand against his sternum, breathing slow, willing the discomfort to pass. "Dad." Kellen's voice cracked with worry as the officers guided him toward the cruiser. "Dad, are you okay?" "I'm fine," Elias lied, though his face had gone pale. "Don't worry about me. Worry about yourself." The officers pushed Kellen's head down gently as they guided him into the back seat, the door slamming shut with a finality that made Maribel's knees nearly buckle. Mercer sauntered over to the cruiser window, leaning down with a mocking little salute. "Welcome to the system, hero." The car pulled away from the curb, leaving Maribel sobbing on the lawn, and Elias standing pale and shaken beside her, his hand still pressed against his aching chest. By that evening, a grainy cell phone video of the arrest had already begun spreading online, the caption reading simply, "They arrested him for defending his parents." Inside the house, hands trembling. Maribel picked up the phone and dialed a number a neighbor had given her weeks ago, a civil rights attorney named Serena Blake. Serena Blake arrived at the Brooks house the next morning, a worn leather briefcase in one hand and a legal pad already half filled with notes in the other. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a reputation in the county for taking cases other lawyers wouldn't touch. Maribel let her in, her face pale and exhausted from a sleepless night spent staring at her phone, freshing the jail's online roster, waiting for any sign that her son had been processed safely. "Tell me everything," Blake said, settling at the kitchen table. "From the very beginning. Don't leave anything out." Elias sat across from her, his bruised arm now wrapped in a light bandage, and walked her through it all. Lila's strange behavior at the window, the 911 call, Mercer's aggression, Kellen's intervention, the humiliating arrest. The following day, Blake listened without interrupting, scribbling notes furiously, her jaw tightening more with every detail. "This cell phone video," she said finally, pulling out her phone and pulling up the clip that had been circulating since last night. "It's only 30 seconds. It starts after Mercer already has your arm. We need the full footage, the part that shows what actually happened from the beginning." "There were a few people filming," Maribel said. "But Officer Mercer had a body cam too. Shouldn't that show everything?" Blake's expression hardened. "It should. I requested it first thing this morning." She tapped a finger against her notepad. The department's response was that the footage is corrupted, unretrievable. Elias let out a bitter laugh. "Of course it is. I don't believe that for a second," Blake said. "Convenient malfunctions don't happen to convenient officers without help. I'm going to keep pushing for it, but in the meantime, I need you to think hard." "Did any of your neighbors have security cameras? Doorbell cameras? Anything facing the street?" Maribel thought for a moment, then shook her head slowly. "I don't know. We never paid attention to things like that." "Start paying attention," Blake said, standing and gathering her things. "I'm going to need everything I can find before the arraignment." Across town, in a cramped office cluttered with old newspapers and a wall covered in printed articles, journalist Camille Foster sat hunched over her laptop, the cell phone video paused on her screen. She had seen it shared dozens of times overnight, the caption growing angrier and more viral with every repost. Something about the story snagged at her. A massive black man arrested the day after defending his elderly parents from an officer who'd clearly overstepped. It smelled like exactly the kind of story she'd built her career chasing, the kind that exposed rot hiding just beneath a quiet, ordinary surface. She filed a public records request for Officer Grant Mercer's personnel file before her coffee had even gone cold. The response took 2 days, But when it landed in her inbox, Camille nearly dropped her mug. 3 prior complaints. Excessive force, twice. Improper conduct during a traffic stop, once. All 3 dismissed within weeks of being filed. All 3 reviewed and closed under the signature of the same man, Chief Harlan Crow. Camille leaned back in her chair, her pulse quickening. A pattern wasn't an accident. A pattern was a choice. Someone somewhere choosing again and again to look the other way. She pulled up everything she could find on Crow next. Years on the force, a spotless public record, and buried in an old community newsletter from nearly a decade ago, a single sentence that made her sit up straighter. Congratulations to Officer Grant Mercer, nephew of Sergeant Harlan Crow, on his graduation from the academy. There it was. Family protecting family. A badge protecting a badge. Camille picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd jotted down from a mutual contact earlier that morning. Serena Blake, the attorney representing the Brooks family. The call connected on the second ring. Ms. Blake, my name is Camille Foster. I'm a reporter with the Tribune. I think I have something you're going to want to see. There was a brief pause on the line, then Blake's voice, sharp and alert. I'm listening. Officer Grant Mercer has 3 prior complaints, all dismissed by the same chief. And that chief happens to be his uncle. Silence stretched for a moment as the pieces clicked into place on both ends of the line. Can you meet tomorrow afternoon? Blake finally asked. I think we need to compare notes. I'll bring everything I have, Camille said. By the time she hung up, the sun outside her window had begun to dip low, casting the cluttered office in amber light. And for the first time since she'd started digging, Camille felt certain this story was far bigger than one bad arrest. The coffee shop on 5th Street was nearly empty by the time Serena Blake slid into the corner booth across from Camille Foster the next afternoon. A folder of papers spread between them like a hand of cards neither wanted to play too soon. Mercer's history confirms the pattern, Blake said, tapping the printed complaints. But it doesn't explain why that call was made in the first place. Why now? Why the Brookses? Camille pulled out a thinner folder, her eyes bright with the particular excitement of a reporter who knew she'd found something good. I dug into the property records around Maple Ridge Lane. There's a development company called Crestline Partners buying up parcels along that street for the last 18 months. Quiet acquisitions, nothing flashy. And Lila Crow is listed as a minority stakeholder. Camille slid a printed document across the table. She stands to make a 6-figure payout if every property on that block sells before the rezoning vote next spring. The Brookses are one of 3 houses left holding out. Blake stared at the document, her jaw tightening. She called the police on her own neighbors, people she's known for years, over money. It gets worse, Camille said. I pulled the HOA meeting minutes from 2 months ago. Crow specifically asked the Brookses if they'd considered selling. Elias told her no, politely but clearly. Blake leaned back against the booth, exhaling slowly. So that 911 call wasn't a mistake. It wasn't fear. It was strategy. That's how it's looking, Camille said. Blake closed the folder, her mind already racing through how this new piece would reshape the case. Not just a story of one officer's prejudice, but a calculated scheme dressed up as a panicked phone call. She thanked Camille, gathered her things, and headed straight for her car, eager to bring the family this new threat before the arraignment. She never made the call she'd planned that evening. Inside the Brooks house, Elias sat in his recliner, a cup of untouched tea cooling on the side table, his face pale and clammy despite the warm evening air drifting through the open window. Elias. Maribel looked up from the couch, noticing the strange stillness in her husband's posture. You all right? Just tired, Elias murmured, though his hand had drifted to his chest, pressing lightly against his sternum the same way it had the day Kellen was arrested. "You said that yesterday, too." Maribel rose from the couch, crossing the room toward him, worry sharpening her voice. "Elias, look at me." His breathing had grown shallow. A faint sheen of sweat had broken out across his forehead. "Elias." He didn't answer. His eyes fluttered, his body sagging sideways in the recliner. Maribel screamed for help and grabbed the phone, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it twice before managing to dial 911. The hospital waiting room smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee. Maribel sat hunched in a plastic chair, twisting a tissue into shreds between her fingers. When Kellen walked through the double doors hours later, having just been released on bail that afternoon, he still wore the same clothes from his arrest, wrinkled and tired. But the moment he saw his mother's face, every ounce of his own exhaustion vanished. "Mom." He dropped to one knee beside her chair. "What happened? Is Dad?" "They said it was stress," Maribel whispered, tears slipping freely down her cheeks now. "His heart. They're calling it a minor cardiac event. But Kellen, his face, I've never seen him look like that." A doctor emerged a few minutes later, explaining gently that Elias was stable, that they were keeping him overnight for observation, that stress had clearly taken a toll on a heart already strained by age and grief. Kellen sat beside his father's hospital bed long into the night, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest, the soft beeping of machines, the only sound in the dim room. Elias's hand, still bruised from Mercer's grip days earlier, rested limp against the white blanket. "This is my fault," Kellen murmured to the empty room. "If I hadn't stepped outside." "Don't you dare!" Elias's voice rasped, eyes fluttering open. "Don't you dare blame yourself for standing up for your family." Kellen's throat tightened. "Dad, I'm proud of you," Elias said, his voice weak but certain. "No matter what happens next, I need you to know that." Kellen reached out, gently taking his father's bruised hand in his own, and for a long while, neither of them said anything else. By morning, Elias was discharged with strict orders to rest, and Serena Blake arrived at the house that evening with the news about Lila Crow, hoping the truth might finally begin tipping the scales back in the family's favor. The story broke early the next morning, splashed across the Tribune's website beneath a headline that spread like wildfire before most of the city had finished its first cup of coffee. "Pattern of abuse. Officer's history of complaints buried by family connection." Camille Foster had written every word carefully, laying out the 3 dismissed complaints against Officer Grant Mercer, the family relationship with Chief Harlan Crow, and the timeline connecting it all to the arrest of a decorated Navy SEAL defending his elderly parents. By noon, the article had been shared thousands of times. By evening, local news vans were parked outside the precinct. The pressure worked fast. That afternoon, Serena Blake received a call from a contact inside Internal Affairs, confirming that a formal investigation had been opened, not just into Mercer's conduct, but into Crow's handling of every complaint that had crossed his desk in the last 5 years. "This is real movement," Blake told the Brookses that evening, sitting at their kitchen table with a folder of fresh notes. "Investigations like this don't happen overnight. Somebody upstairs is finally paying attention." Elias, still recovering and under doctor's orders to take it easy, sat in his chair with a blanket draped over his knees, listening with cautious hope flickering behind tired eyes. The momentum grew stronger the next day when a retired officer named Omar Langston contacted Internal Affairs directly, offering to testify about an incident years earlier where he'd witnessed Mercer shove a handcuffed suspect face first into a patrol car for no reason other than the man mouthing off. Langston had filed a report at the time. It had vanished into the same drawer as every other complaint. "He's corroborating everything," Blake told Maribel over the phone, her voice carrying a rare note of excitement. A retired officer with nothing to gain by lying. This is exactly the kind of witness that moves a case. For the first time in nearly a week, the Brooks house felt lighter. That evening, Maribel cooked a full dinner: fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread. Still warm from the oven, filling the kitchen with smells that hadn't drifted through the house since before any of this began. Kellen set the table, while Elias, color slowly returning to his face, told an old story about the time he'd nearly burned down their first apartment trying to fry catfish. Maribel laughed so hard she had to wipe tears from her eyes. And for a few precious hours, the family let themselves believe the worst might truly be behind them. "Blake thinks the charges might get dropped," Maribel said, passing the cornbread to her son. With everything coming out about Mercer and his uncle, she said the DA might not want to go forward at all. Kellen allowed himself a small, cautious smile. "I'd like to believe that." "Believe it," Elias said firmly. "After everything we've survived, we deserve some good news." Just as they were finishing dinner, Kellen's phone buzzed against the table. He glanced at the screen, his stomach tightening when he saw the caller ID, his commanding officer's administrative office. He stepped into the hallway to answer, his family's laughter fading slightly behind him. "Petty Officer Brooks," the voice on the other end said, crisp and formal. "We're calling regarding the pending charge against you. Command has been made aware of the situation and the ongoing local investigation." "Yes, sir," Kellen said, bracing himself. "I want to be straightforward with you. A pending assault charge, regardless of circumstances, puts your security clearance under review. We're monitoring the situation closely, but until this is resolved, your status remains uncertain." Kellen closed his eyes, pressing a hand against the wall to steady himself. Everything he'd worked for, years of training, deployments, sacrifice, hanging in the balance because of a lie typed up by a man who couldn't stand being humiliated in front of a crowd. "Understood, sir," Kalen said, his voice carefully even, despite the weight settling in his chest. "Thank you for letting me know." The call ended, and Kellen stood alone in the hallway for a long moment, staring at the warm light spilling from the kitchen where his family's laughter had finally returned. He didn't want to ruin the moment, not tonight, not after the week they'd all survived. He took a slow breath, pushed his shoulders back, and walked into the kitchen with a smile fixed carefully in place. "Everything okay?" Maribel asked, glancing up from the table. "Everything's fine," Kellen said, sitting back down beside his father. But as he reached for his fork, the warmth of the dinner couldn't quite chase away the cold knot tightening in his stomach, the quiet fear that the hope filling this kitchen tonight might not survive the days ahead. Chief Harlan Crow sat across from the district attorney in a small conference room downtown, the morning light cutting hard lines across the table between them. He'd requested this meeting himself before the internal affairs investigation could gain any more ground. "I'm aware of the article," Crow said, keeping his voice measured, controlled. "I'm aware of the optics, but Kellen Brooks's charge has nothing to do with any of that. Assault is assault." The DA, a tired-looking man named Julian Park, rubbed his temples. "Harlan, the whole department is under a microscope right now. If we push this forward and it turns out your nephew lied—" "That's exactly why we should push it forward," Crow interrupted smoothly. "If we drop it now, it looks like we're caving to pressure, like we're admitting guilt before any investigation even concludes. Let the court sort out the truth. Internal affairs can run their review separately." Park hesitated, weighing the political risk on both sides, then finally nodded. "Fine. We proceed. But Harlan, if this falls apart, it falls on you." Crow forced a tight smile. "It won't." He walked out of that meeting, having bought himself time. But he knew time alone wouldn't be enough. The video was still the real threat. That afternoon a clip began circulating from an anonymous account, edited down to 8 tight seconds. Kellen crossing the lawn fast, fists clenched at his sides. Mercer stumbling backward with his hand on his taser. Cut. No context. No mention of Elias being grabbed. No sign of Mercer's earlier aggression. Just a massive man charging an officer. The caption read, "Footage shows the hero lunging first. Judge for yourself." It spread faster than Camille's article ever had. By evening, the tide had turned violently. Comment sections filled with strangers calling Kellen a thug, a liar, a danger to public safety. News outlets that had run sympathetic stories days earlier scrambled to cover the new footage, hedging their previous coverage with cautious, doubt-laced language. Kellen sat in his parents' living room, scrolling through the wreckage on his phone, his jaw tight enough to ache. "It's edited," Blake said over speakerphone, her voice clipped with fury. "Anyone with eyes can see it's cut. But it doesn't matter right now. It's already out there." That same evening, his phone rang again, his command for the second time in 3 days. "Petty Officer Brooks, given the new developments and the DA's decision to proceed with charges, your security clearance is being formally suspended pending the outcome of your case." Kellen closed his eyes, the words landing like a physical blow. Everything. Years of his life. His entire identity. Hanging by a thread held by men who had never met him, who knew nothing about him beyond a fabricated police report and an 8-second clip stripped of truth. He hung up the phone and sat in silence, the weight of it pressing down on his chest. He didn't notice at first the sound from the kitchen. A low groan followed by the heavy clatter of a chair scraping against the floor. "Elias!" Maribel's voice sharp with sudden panic. Kellen was on his feet instantly, racing into the kitchen to find his father slumped against the table, one hand clutched to his chest, his face ashen and damp with sweat, his breathing ragged and shallow. "Dad!" Kellen dropped beside him, his training taking over even as panic threatened to swallow him whole. "Dad, stay with me. Mom, call 911. Now." Maribel's hands shook violently as she dialed, her voice cracking as she gave the address, begging the dispatcher to hurry. Kellen eased his father gently to the floor, checking his pulse, keeping his voice low and steady even as his own heart pounded against his ribs. "You're going to be okay. Stay with me. Stay with me, Dad." Elias's eyes fluttered, unfocused, his lips moving without sound. The ambulance arrived 11 minutes later, though to Kellen, kneeling on that kitchen floor with his father's weak pulse beneath his fingers, it felt like 11 lifetimes. At the hospital, doctors rushed Elias into emergency care, his condition listed as critical but stable, his heart having suffered far more damage this time than the first scare days earlier. Kellen stood in the hallway outside the ICU, his hands still trembling, watching through a narrow window as machines monitored his father's fragile heartbeat. Maribel wept silently beside him, her face buried against his arm. Everything they had hoped for 2 nights ago, the dinner, the laughter, the cautious optimism, felt like it belonged to some other family, some other life, swept away in less than 48 hours by a lie, an edited video, and a system built to protect itself before it ever protected the truth. 2 days passed in the dim quiet of the hospital, marked only by the soft beep of monitors and the slow shuffle of nurses changing shifts. Elias's condition had stabilized, though the doctors spoke in careful, guarded tones about strain on the heart, about rest, about the dangers of stress at his age. Maribel sat in the chair beside his bed almost without moving, her hand wrapped around his, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest like it was the only thing holding the world together. Kellen paced the hallway outside, his phone gripped tight in one hand, the suspended clearance notice still glowing faintly on the screen from when he'd read it for the 10th time that morning. He felt useless in a way training had never prepared him for. An enemy he couldn't see, couldn't fight with his hands, slowly dismantling everything his family had built. That afternoon, Camille Foster showed up at the hospital, having heard through Blake about Elias's second cardiac event. She found Maribel in the small family waiting room, sitting alone while Kellen grabbed coffee down the hall. "Mrs. Brooks, I'm so sorry," Camille said gently, sitting beside her. "I won't take much of your time." Maribel studied the young reporter's face, searching for something. Sincerity, maybe, or simply someone willing to listen. "You're the one who wrote about Mercer, about his uncle." "I am?" Camille hesitated, choosing her next words carefully. "I know you've been through more than any family should have to go through. But the public only knows pieces of your story right now. And pieces are easy to twist. That edited video proved that." Maribel's jaw tightened. "They turned my son into a monster with 8 seconds of film." "I know," Camille said. "And I think the only way to fix that is to let people hear the whole truth in your own words. Not a clip, not a headline. You." Maribel was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands, worn from decades of gardening and dishwashing, and holding her family together through every storm life had thrown at them. She thought of Elias, pale and fragile in that hospital bed. She thought of Kellen carrying guilt that wasn't his to carry. She thought of every name she'd ever scrolled past in the news. Every family failed by silence. "All right," Maribel said finally, lifting her chin. "Ask me anything." The interview ran for nearly an hour. Maribel's voice was steady even as tears slipped down her cheeks, describing the fear of watching her husband's arm bruise beneath an officer's grip, the terror of seeing her son handcuffed in their own yard, the helplessness of sitting beside a hospital bed not once but twice in the same week she held nothing back. Camille published the piece that evening under the headline, "A Mother's Plea. We just want to be left alone." It spread even faster than the edited video had, this time carrying raw, unmistakable humanity that no clever editing could strip away. Public sympathy, which had wavered dangerously after the doctored footage, began swinging firmly back in the family's favor. While Maribel sat with reporters, Serena Blake spent her days going door to door along Maple Ridge Lane, knocking on porches, asking the same question again and again. "Do you have a security camera? Anything facing the street from the day of the first incident?" Most answers were apologetic shrugs. A few homes had cameras angled too narrowly to catch anything useful. By the 4th day of searching, Blake was running out of doors to knock on, frustration tightening behind her eyes with every dead end. She tried one last house at the end of the block, an elderly man named Walter Hale, who rarely left his property and kept an old, unfussy security system mounted above his garage, more out of habit than expectation of ever needing it. "I think it's still recording," Walter said, scratching his head. "Never bothered checking it. Don't even remember the last time I looked at the footage." Blake felt a flicker of hope she hadn't allowed herself in days. "Would you mind if I took a look?" Walter shrugged, leading her inside to an old computer connected to the camera system, the screen flickering to life with grainy, time-stamped footage stretching back weeks. Blake scrolled carefully through the archive, her pulse quickening as she found the date of the first confrontation, the timestamp lining up perfectly with the morning Lila Crow had made her call. Before she could pull up the actual clip, her phone buzzed sharply in her pocket. An unknown number, the caller ID, simply reading U.S. Navy. She stepped outside onto Walter's porch, answering cautiously. "This is Serena Blake." "Ms. Blake," a deep, steady voice said on the other end. "My name is Master Chief Sterling Hawthorne. I'm Petty Officer Brooks's commanding officer. I think we need to talk." Serena Blake stood on Walter's porch, the phone pressed to her ear, her heart hammering as the deep, even voice on the other end introduced himself. Master Chief Sterling Hawthorne, he repeated. I oversee Petty Officer Brooks's unit. I've read everything coming out about this case, and I think you and I have pieces of the same puzzle. I'm listening, Blake said, glancing back through Walter's screen door at the old computer still glowing with grainy footage. The military doesn't take kindly to one of our own being railroaded by a falsified report, Hawthorne said. We started looking into Officer Mercer the moment his name surfaced in connection with Petty Officer Brooks's case. Turns out one of his prior complaints, the one filed years ago and quietly dismissed, came from a man who just left active duty, a veteran. Mercer roughed him up during a routine stop and lied about it then, too. Blake's grip tightened on the phone. That complaint was buried by Chief Crow. Same as the others, Hawthorne confirmed. We've been building our own file. I'd like to bring what we have directly to you in person today, if possible. There's something you should see too, Blake said, glancing back at Walter's grainy archive. I think I just found footage of the entire first incident, start to finish. There was a brief pause on the line. Then, I'll meet you wherever you need me to be. 2 hours later, Blake sat in the small hospital waiting room with Kellen and Maribel, the laptop from Walter's house open on the table between them, when a tall, broad-shouldered man in dress uniform walked through the doors, his presence immediately commanding the attention of every nurse and visitor in the hallway. Kellen rose to his feet instantly. Master Chief, at ease, Brooks, Hawthorne said, though his eyes carried none of his usual gruffness, only quiet concern. I came as soon as I could. He shook Maribel's hand gently, expressing his sympathy for Elias's condition before turning his attention to the laptop screen. Show me, he said. Blake pulled up the footage from Walter's security camera, the timestamp confirming it was recorded the exact morning of the first confrontation. The video, though grainy and slightly distant, captured everything clearly enough. Mercer's car pulling up, his aggressive posture from the very first moment, the rough grab on Elias's arm, Maribel being shoved back against the porch railing, and finally, Kellen's calm, controlled approach with no aggression whatsoever, hands open, voice steady, exactly as he described it from the beginning. Maribel pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, tears slipping down her cheeks as she watched the entire ordeal unfold in unedited, undeniable detail. This changes everything, Blake murmured, already imagining how this footage would dismantle the doctored clip that had turned public opinion against them. Hawthorne nodded grimly before opening a folder of his own, sliding it across the table. And this confirms a pattern that goes back further than anyone realized. Inside were copies of the original complaint filed years earlier by the veteran Mercer had assaulted during a traffic stop, a complaint that matched almost word for word the treatment Elias had received, right down to the excessive force and the falsified report claiming resistance that never happened. Chief Crow buried this one too, Hawthorne said. Stamped it unfounded within a week of it being filed. The veteran who filed it left the area not long after, convinced nothing would ever come of it. Blake exhaled slowly, the full shape of the conspiracy finally coming into focus. Not one bad cop protected by one careless chief, but a pattern stretching back years, deliberately concealed, deliberately ignored. This is enough, Blake said, her voice firm with resolve. This is more than enough. I want this handled the right way, Hawthorne said, looking directly at Kellen. Not buried in some quiet plea deal where Mercer gets a slap on the wrist and Crow walks away clean. I want this out in the open, in front of everyone. Kellen met his commanding officer's gaze, something steadying in his chest for the first time in days. I want that too. Blake closed the laptop carefully, already mapping out the path forward in her mind. Then we're not settling. We're forcing a public hearing. Every piece of this, the footage, the falsified reports, Crow's financial motive, Crow's cover-up, goes on record in front of the city where nobody can edit it down to 8 seconds and call it the truth. Maribel looked toward the ICU doors where her husband lay recovering just down the hall and felt something fierce and unyielding settle into her chest. "Then let's make sure everyone sees it," she said. Word of the emergency city council hearing spread fast over the following days, fueled by Camille Foster's relentless coverage and the growing public outcry over the doctored video. By the time Elias was finally discharged from the hospital, weak but stable, under strict orders to avoid stress, Serena Blake had secured a date, pressuring the council into an open session rather than allowing the case to disappear behind closed doors. The council chamber was packed beyond capacity the morning of the hearing. Every seat filled. Reporters lining the back wall with cameras raised. Elias sat in the front row in a wheelchair, still recovering, with Maribel's hand resting protectively on his shoulder. Kellen sat beside them in his dress uniform, spine straight, jaw set, the weight of everything riding on the next hour. Chief Harlan Crow sat near the front with department officials, his face carefully composed, though his eyes flicked nervously toward the side door more than once. Officer Grant Mercer sat a few rows back, arms crossed, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. Blake rose first, her voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber. "What the public was shown days ago was 8 seconds of carefully edited footage," she began. "Today you'll see the truth in full." She played Walter's security footage on the chamber's projector, the grainy but unmistakable video unfolding before hundreds of eyes. Mercer's aggression from the very first moment, his grip tightening on Elias's bruised arm, Maribel shoved back against the railing, and Kellen's calm, controlled approach that followed. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several council members exchanged grim, furious glances. "This is not a man who lunged at an officer," Blake said. "This is a son protecting his parents from an officer who never should have grabbed an elderly man in the first place." Master Chief Sterling Hawthorne rose next, presenting the military's findings, the buried complaint from years earlier, the veteran assaulted under nearly identical circumstances, the pattern of dismissed reports stretching back further than anyone outside the department had known. "Chief Crow didn't just fail to investigate his nephew," Hawthorne said, his voice steady and unflinching. "He actively protected a pattern of abuse for years at the expense of every person who trusted this department to do its job." Crow's face had gone pale, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. Then Camille Foster took her turn, reading aloud the financial records connecting Lila Crow to Crestline Partners, the development company quietly buying up properties along Maple Ridge Lane, and the HOA meeting minutes proving Crow had personally pressured the Brookses to sell months before her 911 call. Murmurs swept through the chamber, heads turning toward Lila, who sat stiffly near the back, her face draining of color as every eye in the room settled on her. "Is it true," one council member asked, leaning forward, "that you stood to profit financially from your neighbors selling their home?" Lila's mouth opened, closed, opened again. That call was about safety. I genuinely believed." "The records say otherwise," the council member said flatly, cutting her off. Lila's voice cracked, her carefully composed story collapsing in real time as the room watched. The truth she'd hidden behind for weeks finally laid bare in front of the very community she'd tried to manipulate. Mercer, sensing the tide turning irreversibly against him, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier bravado nowhere to be found. "Officer Mercer," the council chair said, turning toward him directly. "Do you have anything to say regarding the discrepancies between your official report and the footage just presented?" Mercer opened his mouth, but no convincing answer came. He glanced toward his uncle, searching for some lifeline that wasn't there anymore. Crow stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, offering nothing. The silence stretched long and damning. Kellen watched it all unfold from the front row, his father's hand finding his own and squeezing tight. His mother's quiet tears finally tears of something other than grief. The council chair finally rose, surveying the stunned chamber. Given the gravity of what's been presented today, this body requires immediate recess to determine appropriate action, she announced. We will reconvene within the hour. The room erupted into hushed, urgent conversation as the chair and council members filed out, leaving Mercer and Crow sitting visibly shaken under the weight of hundreds of eyes. The truth finally too large and too public for either of them to bury. The hour-long recess felt endless. Reporters huddled in the hallway, whispering theories. Elias sat quietly in his wheelchair, his hand still wrapped tightly around Kellen's, while Maribel paced near the chamber doors, unable to sit still. When the council chair finally returned, the room fell silent so fast it seemed to suck the air out of the chamber. After reviewing the evidence presented today, the chair began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone. This council finds the original report filed against Kellen Brooks to be unsupported by the verified footage. All charges against Mr. Brooks are hereby ordered dropped, effective immediately. A wave of sound rolled through the room. Gasps. A few scattered claps quickly hushed. Maribel's hand flying to her mouth as a sob of relief broke loose. Kellen closed his eyes, the weight of weeks finally lifting from his shoulders, his father's grip tightening around his hand. The chair wasn't finished. Furthermore, given the evidence of falsified police reports and the destruction of body cam footage, this council is formally referring Officer Grant Mercer for criminal charges related to filing a false report and civil rights violations. Two uniformed officers standing near the side exit moved forward without hesitation. Mercer's face went white as they approached, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "Officer Mercer, you're under arrest," one of them said, pulling cuffs from his belt. The chamber erupted into murmurs as Mercer was turned, his hands secured behind his back. The same cold metal click that had once closed around Kellen's wrists, now closing around his own. He was led out past rows of stunned faces, past the same community members who had once watched silently as he humiliated an old man in his own yard. The chair turned next toward Crow, her expression hardening further. "Chief Crow, given clear evidence that you suppressed multiple legitimate complaints against your nephew over a period of years, this council has no confidence in your continued leadership of this department." Crow rose stiffly, his face a mask of controlled defeat. "I'll submit my resignation effective today," he said quietly, his voice stripped of the authority it once carried. "And I'll cooperate fully with any review." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to accountability the room would get from him. And for now, it would have to be enough. Finally, the chair's gaze settled on Lila Crow, who sat frozen near the back of the room, her earlier explanations having crumbled completely under scrutiny. "Miss Crow, council is recommending an immediate restraining order be filed by the Brooks family, along with a full investigation into your involvement with Crestline Partners and any related harassment of your neighbors." Lila said nothing. She simply stared at her hands, the consequences of her greed finally catching up to her in front of the entire community she'd tried to manipulate. The chair closed with one final statement, her eyes finding Elias and Maribel in the front row. "On behalf of this city, I want to offer a formal apology to the Brooks family for the trauma inflicted upon them by individuals who were sworn to protect this community instead of terrorize it. The city will be covering the remaining balance on your mortgage as part of a formal settlement, effective immediately." Maribel broke down completely then, burying her face against Elias's shoulder, his own eyes wet with tears he no longer tried to hide. Kellen pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed his commanding officer first, his voice cracking with relief as he relayed the news. Then he turned to his parents, kneeling beside his father's wheelchair. "It's over," he said softly. It's really over. No? Elias said, wiping his eyes, a faint smile breaking through the exhaustion on his face. It's just beginning. Now we get to actually live again. Outside the chamber, reporters swarmed for statements. But for the first time in weeks, the Brookses didn't feel like a story being told about them. They felt like a family whose truth had finally been heard. That evening, back at the hospital for one final check before Elias's full discharge, Kellen called the news into his mother's sister, his voice steady and strong, repeating the words again and again like he still couldn't quite believe them himself. All charges dropped. Mercer under arrest. Crow gone. We won. Maribel sat beside Elias's bed, holding his hand, watching her son's face light up with something she hadn't seen in weeks. Not just relief, but hope. Real and solid. And finally, theirs to keep. 1 week later, the late morning sun spilled warm and golden across Maple Ridge Lane, the same light that had once fallen so peacefully over the Brooks garden before everything changed. Elias sat in the passenger seat of Kellen's car as it pulled up to the curb, his color fully returned, his strength slowly rebuilding with each passing day. You didn't have to make a fuss, Elias said, though his voice carried no real protest. Dad, Kellen said, putting the car in park. Look outside. Elias turned toward the window and went still. The entire street had gathered on their lawn. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder across the grass. The same teenage boy who'd once filmed in stunned silence now holding a handwritten sign that read, "Welcome home, Mr. Brooks." The woman from across the street stood near the porch with a tray of lemonade. Even families from the far end of the block, people Elias barely knew by name, had come to stand on his lawn that morning. Maribel stepped out of the house onto the porch, her hands pressed to her chest, tears already gathering as she watched her husband and son step out of the car together. "Welcome home," she called out, her voice breaking with joy instead of grief for the first time in weeks. Elias made his way slowly up the front walk, leaning lightly on Kellen's arm, while the gathered crowd applauded and called out greetings, some reaching out simply to shake his hand, others offering quiet apologies for staying silent too long during everything that had happened. Serena Blake stood near the edge of the lawn, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction, a folder of finalized paperwork tucked under her arm, the settlement complete, the restraining order against Lila Crow filed, the case fully closed in the Brooks' favor. Beside her, Camille Foster snapped a few photos, not for another headline this time, but simply because the moment felt worth remembering. "You did good work," Blake said, glancing at her. "We both did," Camille replied, lowering her camera as Elias reached the porch steps and turned to face the crowd that had gathered for him. A car door closed behind them, and Master Chief Sterling Hawthorne stepped out, dressed in full uniform, having driven 2 hours that morning just to be there. He crossed the lawn directly to Kellen, who straightened instinctively at his approach. "Master Chief." "At ease, Brooks." Hawthorne extended a hand, his grip firm. "Your clearance has been fully reinstated, effective immediately." Kellen exhaled, something in his chest finally loosening after weeks of uncertainty. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me," Hawthorne said, his eyes drifting briefly to Elias and Maribel standing together on the porch. "You earned this the moment you put your family first and your training second. That's exactly the kind of man this uniform should represent." Kellen nodded, unable to find words equal to the moment, and simply shook his commanding officer's hand again, firmer this time. The afternoon unfolded slowly and warmly. Plates of food passed between neighbors who had once only waved politely from across the street, now sharing stories and laughter on the Brooks lawn like old friends. Elias held court from a lawn chair someone had brought out for him, recounting old memories, occasionally glancing toward Kellen with quiet pride whenever his son's name came up in conversation. Maribel moved through the crowd, hugging neighbors, thanking Blake and Camille individually, her earlier exhaustion replaced by something lighter, something that almost felt like peace. As the sun began its slow descent behind the rooftops, the crowd gradually thinned, neighbors drifting back to their own homes until finally only the Brookses remained on the porch, the lawn quiet again, the chairs and tables waiting to be folded away. Kellen stood at the top of the porch steps, looking out over the street where it had all begun. The same patch of grass where his father had once been grabbed. The same spot where he himself had once stood between his parents and a man who saw only a threat instead of a son. He turned to face Elias and Maribel standing together by the front door, watching him with eyes full of quiet pride. Kellen straightened his shoulders, squared his stance, and raised his hand in a slow, formal salute. Elias's chin lifted. Maribel's hand found her husband's, gripping it tightly. Down the street. A few lingering neighbors who'd paused to watch began to clap, the sound rising softly into the evening air, carrying across the lawn that had witnessed both their darkest day and now, finally, their brightest one. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like to support my channel and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.